Tilea's Troubles, Part 130. The Battle for Eclano. The Realm of Portomaggiore. The End of Autumn, 2404. The Villa Bruscata was neatly laid out. It had an ancient, sturdy temple, possessing chapel alcoves dedicated to Mor, Mamidia and Macopia, and minor shrines for several other gods of note, while the house was a more modern affair. Both were incorporated into a walled yard, beside which was a well-tended orchard. Laying in a wide valley in the Savuolo Hills, in the region known as Eclano, to the east of the ancient road running south of Portomaggiore, it was normally a very haven of peace. Today was to prove an exception. A substantial force of Sartosan pirates, a detached part of Admiral Volker's invading army, commanded by the sorcerer Adus Arcabar, had been ravaging the southern region of Scalia, but was now closing in on the villa to increase its haul of loot. As they drew close, their advance party returned to report, being Captain Cardreth Ledforge's Sea Slayers, a dwarven crew who had continued to march in the darkest hours of the night while the rest of the force rested. Ledforge reported that the Portomaggiore city garrison was marching upon the villa too. But not to worry, he added, as he was certain that Admiral Volker was also on his way and should be there soon. But will it be soon enough? Thought Arcabar. It could prove ruinous to attempt to retreat, for then the enemy might gain the initiative, able to pick the pirates off piecemeal as they withdrew. Besides, the Admiral, whom Arcabar considered a good friend, was not a man he wanted to disappoint, and so Arcabar ordered his force to array in line of battle behind the villa. He would see if his force could keep the enemy busy long enough for Volker to arrive. He himself joined Captain Garrick's crew, a body of handgunners, on the right of the line, nearest to the villa. Another smaller company of handgunners stood to their immediate left, being a part of Captain Van Bassa's crew, while the newly arrived dwarfs were beyond, with the rest of Captain Van Bassa's crew on the battle line's far flank. Captain Ledforge led the cheering from his regiment, while Van Bass brooded in his usual manner, employing his hook hand to give rest to his cutlass blade. The Sartosan artillery pieces, big and small, were placed to the far left of the line, with the sakers higher than the swivels and thus able to shoot over them. These were entirely unprotected, perhaps because the Sartosans presumed that anything attempting to close on them would be torn to pieces by the sheer weight of firepower they could bring to bear. And yet, a body of enemy light horse was indeed riding upon that flank, and boldly crested a hill to stare right at the serried muzzles. Upon the enemy's other flank there were more pistoliers, 2 companies, beside a ribordequin with shiny brass barrels. These riders also promptly advanced, more cautiously than their counterparts on the far left of the line, riding through the orchard and thus concealing their movement. This pincer movement of light horse seemed to prove that the Portomaggiorans had come here to fight. The force massed in the centre of the Portomaggiore line was clearly intended to be a defensive garrison, for the vast majority were missile troops, with a large regiment of Sea Guard handgunners, a body of mercenary dwarven crossbows, and the local Eclanian militia crossbowmen, the latter mustered under an impressive Portomaggiore standard bearing a falcone emblem, revealing that much of Eclano was Lord Alessio's family estates. The main fighting regiment was beside the handgunners, being the Sea Guard swordsmen, an elite body under the command of Lord Nero Achau, military governor of the city-state in Lord Alessio's absence. One of the garrison's 2 wizards was also among their ranks, the other having joined the handgunners. Even more crossbowmen had taken position on the higher ground to the right of their line, ordered to keep an eye out for the enemy relief force, known to be on its way. Behind these was the garrison's 2nd fighting regiment, the mercenary dwarfs under Gersiak Irongrim, being mostly his own clan warriors, and behind them were 4 brutes, carrying cannons, or lead-belchers as they themselves called them. These had the potential to be incredibly destructive, both when shooting and when fighting. while the Sartosans in the main line shuffled a little to better align themselves to the foe, with Captain Garric's personally commanded handgunners wheeling about to get a better line of sight on whatever was disturbing the trees of the orchard. The swivel gunners turned their attention upon the little company of horse up ahead, bringing 2 of them down. The survivors were not dismayed by their comrades' demise, and continued their ride. Arcabar intended, now that he could see what was moving through the trees, to conjure a fireball at the pistoliers in the orchard, but his efforts were thwarted by the enemy's wizards, who unwound the etheric vapours he was coiling to form a fiery flash. The 3 cannons all targeted the main dwarf regiment, 2 employing chain shot, but only 1 was to prove successful, killing 5. Irongrim's warriors were battle-hardened veterans, however, and despite not one being unspattered by the blood of their fallen comrades, they began their advance, the ogres following behind, matching the dwarf's slow pace. The last of the pistoliers on the pirates' left, keen both to avoid further harm and to contribute to the struggle, rode quickly to flank the enemy's artillery, but perhaps due to being somewhat shaken, their shots all missed. Near the villa, the harbour guard swordsmen marched up beside the chapel, while the wizard with them attempted to summon a magical burning gaze on Garric's handgunners. Arcabar sensed the impending danger and used his precious scroll to dispel the attack. The wizard with the Seaguard handgunners, however, had also conjured fire magic, hurling a fireball at the smallest of the 2 enemy handgunner companies. This killed more than half of them. Despite the harm, those remaining stayed put. While the crossbowmen on the hill managed to bring down 1 of the swivel gunners, 2 of the ogres could aim their muzzles at Van Bassa's regiment. Their blast killed 2. Then the dwarfs put down another 3, and the Eclanian standing force crossbows added another casualty. Van Bass and his men barely flinched. The grey-coated captain simply stared intently at the foe, as if he knew something they did not. It was then that Volker and his large relief force began to arrive. Their sudden appearance so soon in the struggle made it immediately obvious that the Portomaggiorans were very unlikely to prevail, being both outflanked and vastly outnumbered, despite the fact that the Admiral had left several regiments and his second wizard elsewhere to continue their plunder. It was not entirely impossible that Lord Alessio might appear with his own army, returning from the Holy War against the vampires in the north, for he had a reputation as one of the best generals in Tilea, with many victories under his belt. But everyone, on both sides, knew this was unlikely, as he was reported to be many, many leagues from home. For reasons known only to himself, he had not embarked his force, or even a portion of it, onto ships in Remas to make the last part of the journey home by sea, as many in the city expected, but had taken the longer route over land. Admiral Volker himself led the largest regiment, consisting of his own crew, now outnumbering the goblins, who had lost much of their number during earlier squabbling. His trusted navigator, Obadiah el-Nur, was by his side in the front rank, the pair of them showing the eclectic nature of the Sartosan army. The Admiral, clean-shaven in a black coat, hat, linen neckcloth and a dull green waistcoat, being a northern fashion, while the big bearded Arabian wore a turban, loose-sleeved yellow shirt and baggy breeches fastened at his ankles. Topping the rise on their left flank, and matching their advance, came the newest reinforcements in the Sartosan fleet, the ogre Captain Kroll's crew of axemen. Kroll's pet parrot, a giant amongst its kind, as befitted such a hulk as Kroll, flapped down a few yards ahead, while he himself surveyed the enemy to decide what exactly to do. A moment later, these 2 regimented crews were joined to their right by the rest of the force. Close enough to Volker that he could smell them came the sand trolls, each of whom, were it not for the bent and bowed nature of their spindly limbs, would have stood taller than Kroll. Beside them came the rest of Volker's crew, a large company armed with blunderbusses. Out on the far right of the relief force advanced Captain Fark's goblins, ordered to that position by Volker, who wanted to avoid any further outbreak of greenskin squabbling hindering his victory today. Losing no time, the Sartosans moved on. The trolls, outstripping the rest to close on the dwarves, while Kroll's axe-wielding warriors came very close to the crossbow regiment's flank. Captain Farrack, however, ordered his regimented crew of greenskins to turn to face the 3 pistoliers, which might seem a waste of his crew's fighting strength, but he had been looking for every chance to prove he really could shoot his pistol well since fighting the Luccinans 10 months before, and had got it into his head that with a well-placed shot he might dispatch not 1 but 2 of the riders. As he brought his enchanted pistol to bear, delaying just long enough to shout, "Watch this, lads!" once again he was thwarted, as the swivel gunners blasted and killed all 3 riders before he could even pull the trigger. Behind him, a goblin laughed, so he turned and shot him instead. Volker's force advanced, while the sorcerer Adas Akaba hurled a fireball at the pistoliers in the orchard, which was again dispelled by the enemy's magic users. In fury, he instead wove a magically flaming cage around the riders, killing 2, then 2 more when the survivors attempted to flee through the flames. Moments later, there were explosions as the flames heated the riders' powder flasks. This pleased the old wizard, but he cared not if anyone else had noticed. Taking a chance before their line of sight might be obscured, the 2 sakers that were able to fire, the crew of the 3rd struggling to make ready after a misfire, took aim again on the dwarves. Their chain shots tore 4 dwarfs apart, then felled one of the brute ogres behind. The dwarves, nevertheless, and no doubt unwilling to perish before they caused some harm to the foe, charged the trolls. Volker watched with fascination, having never before seen 2 such opponents embroiled together. Even Kroll found himself momentarily distracted by the sight. Out in the centre of the field, the Sartosan dwarves and Van Bassa's crew now saw where things were going, as they watched the enemy's large regiment of elite swordsmen face about and begin marching away. They were unsurprised to see that the enemy's missile troops did not do the same. Presumably, they had been commanded to linger a little longer, to wreak some harm from a distance, delaying the pirates before departing themselves. Perhaps dismayed at the thought that the battle was already lost, the Portomaggiorans' magic users failed to conjure any successful spells, although it could not have helped that one of them had his back turned as he left with the sea guard. The ogre lead belchers joined with the dwarven crossbows, the Eclanian crossbows and the handgunners to pour a veritable storm of lead and bolts into Van Bassa's crew, killing 10 of them. While somewhat concealed by the walls and buildings of the villa, the last company of pistoliers, who had been making heavy work of crossing into the yard, began to file away from the field. The crew of the organ gun were also dragging their burden away, giving thanks to Myrmidia that the pirates could not see them. The Portomaggiore crossbowmen on the far right, somewhat desperately considering how close Kroll and his crew were, loosed their bolts to kill 5 of Volker's men massed down below. Then they were surprised to see Irongrim's dwarfs cut down one of the trolls, wounding another and breaking them. When the trolls lumbered away, the dwarves hurtled forwards into Admiral Volker's regiment. So it was, and somewhat unexpectedly, Volker found himself in personal combat with Thane Gersiak Irongrim, the 2 quickly drawing blood from each other as the warriors around them hacked and hewed with swords and cutlasses. Unwilling to miss out on the slaughter, Captain Kroll shouted, "Right, lads, let's get 'em!" and led his axemen into the flank of the desperately isolated crossbowmen on the hill. The fight was short and bloody, so much that it was over before Kroll felt it had really begun. It was observed from a distance by the goblins, who had turned around to see how the real battle was faring. As the last of the crossbowmen was cut down, Kroll and his crew found themselves at the crest of the hill, looking down upon the enemy's ogres below. Kroll, though he did not show any sign of it to his men, felt disgust, even embarrassment, that fellow ogres would demean themselves so much as to serve as mercenaries for a human lord, receiving pay and eating salted beef and bread instead of taking plunder and eating raw and bloody flesh. As the last of the sand trolls left the battlefield, by the time they halted they had forgotten they had been fighting, Volker's blunderbuss company had also noticed the lead belchers, but, despite the urge to do so, neither they nor Van Bassa's dwindling regiment managed to charge the brutes. This time the Sakers targeted the ogres with their chain shot, both overshooting, and one reaching the dwarf crossbows behind to kill 2. Meanwhile, Admiral Volker remained locked in combat with the mercenary Lord Gersiak, discovering just how difficult it could be to find a chink in dwarven armour. He was thankful of his own protection, in the form of a magical talisman he always carried with him, for there was a moment when without its charming influence he was sure he would have been grievously injured, if not killed. The pirates and warriors around these two fared little better, and despite the Sartosans' greater numbers, the dwarfs stood their ground. Deciding that Kroll and his crew were the greater danger, the lead-belchers turned to present the muzzles of their pieces at them. Kroll let out a laugh, for he was not scared of their carried cannons, and despite knowing how many of his crew would undoubtedly perish should they charge, he fully intended to do so. Upon the other side of the field of battle, the harbour guard handgunners joined the swordsmen in moving back towards the city, although the wizard with them stepped away, intending some more mischief before he too retired. The last surviving company of pistoliers, concealed by the yard and the church, were also in the process of exiting the battlefield, as were the crew of the organ gun up ahead. But the crossbowmen in the middle of the field, both the local standing force and the mercenary dwarves, lingered, slaying another 6 of Captain Van Bass's crew. The captain was beginning to lose his patience, for his crew's role in the battle had so far been nothing more than a magnet for missiles, which meant there were hardly any left standing. "Captain," shouted his boatswain, Mukib Brahimi, "let us get to fighting before there's none of us left, eh?" "Aye," said Captain Van Bass, pointing at the lead-belchers who had just turned their back on him. "Let's start with them." With that, at last, his surviving crew began moving at a pace forwards. As the lead-belchers fired a blast at Kroll's crew, much of which buried itself in the grassy slope leading up to them, Volker noticed the dwarven lord seemed to be tiring. Using an unnaturally precise slash from his enchanted whip as a distraction, coiling the Thane's arm and yanking it aside, he swung his cutlass deftly between Irongrim's helmet and gorget, cutting his head clean off. With 2 more of their own also killed, even the stout-hearted dwarfs lost the will to fight, and so turned to flee. They were cut down by their longer-legged pursuers, however, and Volker and his crew found themselves in combat with the ogres. So thwarted in his intention to take on the ogres himself, Kroll surveyed the ground below the hilltop and decided he would break off from his crew and take on the dwarven crossbows by himself. But he stumbled a little as he descended the slippery grass of the slope towards them, which gave the dwarves time to flee away out of his reach, streaming through the militia crossbowmen and out the other side. Kroll cursed, as it seemed he was not going to get to grips properly with any enemy of note at all that day. The Portomaggiore ogres had quite the opposite problem, for now Captain Van Bass led the last of his crew in a charge against their rear, while Volker's blunderbuss company came in on their flank, so that they were now surrounded by attackers on 3 sides. The wizard Arkabar saw his chance of harming the foe was slipping out of his grasp, and, in clumsy haste, somewhat foolishly attempted to conjure a magical flame cage about the enemy's harbour guard swordsmen. Too hastily, however, for although the spell was brought into being, killing 2 of the enemy, he allowed its etheric energies to swirl beyond his control, causing an explosion of etheric heat to burst from him, scalding his arm and killing 4 of the handgunners beside him, torn apart by a combination of the magical heat and the explosions of their powder flasks and pieces. Seeing little opportunity for the kind of mayhem he liked, Captain Fark commanded his goblins to shift over so that the gunners could sight the foe better, allowing the swivels to so severely maul the militia crossbowmen that they broke and fled away. Kroll cursed again. Would no one stand their ground against him? Then he laughed as he saw a chain shot kill no less than 7 of the fleeing dwarves, leaving but 1 lone survivor reeling in confusion. He laughed even louder when another shot, this time plain old round shot, took the enemy wizard's head clean off. Now came a moment that all who witnessed would remember for the rest of their days. Admiral Volker, his blood well and truly up, lashed so cruelly with his enchanted cat-o'-nine-tails that he killed 2 of the enemy ogres before anyone else could land a blow. Stunned himself at what he'd achieved, he stood panting with exhaustion as the rest of the pirates hacked the last ogre down brutally and quickly. And so ended the fighting at Eclano, Lord Nero led the last of his garrison force away, shouting orders for all to hurry back to the safety of the city walls, with the organ gun and the last few pistoleers in tow, leaving the villa and the rest of Eclano to be plundered by the celebratory Sartosans. The tale most often recounted during drunken revels of the next few days was that of Admiral Volker's whip, pinning a dwarven lord's arm to allow the removal of his head, then so viciously slicing the leathery flesh of the enemy brutes that not one but two fell dead to its attentions. It was close to the time that the Sartosan fleet would vote regarding whether to have a new admiral, but what with these stories and the glut of loot taken from Eclano and Scalia, it seemed the outcome was certain. Admiral Volker had become a legend in his own lifetime. In this hour of need in Portomaggiore, where was Lord Alessio? It seemed that the VMC commander, General Valkenburg, was not the only defender of a realm to have been absent when the pirates came. Or perhaps, more accurately, that Admiral Volker was a proven expert at targeting his cruel raids just when a realm was at its weakest. Itself another reason that he should and would be re-elected as the fleet's commander.